Right folks, I'm just going to do a quick video to review this Mancung £120 crossbow. I'm not going to do videos of shooting pumpkins and empty drinks bottles. There's plenty of them on the web, on YouTube. I'm just going to go through just some of the key features and some of the things that I found interesting in the hope that it'll be of some use to yourselves. Comes in the box. The only assembly required really is installing the prod, because obviously it would be a very large package otherwise. And this is the bow, obviously assembled. You need to insert the prod through the aperture there, string it, bolt on the cocking stirrup, all of which is really very straightforward, and away you go. There's no other assembly required. Just kind of going to work through the gun, but first of all, overall, you kind of may get the impression, and I did initially, that it's a little plasticky, kind of looks a little bit like a toy. It's probably a good time to say that with all crossbows, and certainly anything in this kind of power range, you know, it's not a toy, it's a really serious bit of kit. And it's definitely adults only. You need to be very careful about your backstops, about where you're pointing or where you're shooting the thing. As I said, the appearance may be that it's a little bit tactical, you know, a bit of a toy, but it really isn't, so take the safety seriously. On the construction, obviously this is all polymer, some kind of plastic, but it is really robust. There's no flex or movement at all. It's very, very solid. The barrel is aluminium, steel plates there just to give it some support around the prod. Obviously the stirrup is steel. Most of the trigger housing and the internals of the trigger seem to be pressed steel, and you've got an alloy casting of some sort here to which the sights are mounted. So it's more solid and far less flimsy than it may look. I've shot this for a week or two, and nothing has happened that has changed my opinion in that regard. It's quite solid. Let's start with the most interesting part of the design. It's kind of a semi-bullpup. What I mean by that is, on a conventional gun, rifle, crossbow, the trigger is kind of below the trigger housing. The trigger would be there, so your pistol grip would be here, your trigger would be there, and obviously as a result the stock would be somewhere here. What they've done with this design, and it is interesting, they've effectively slid the action back, or to put it another way, they've slid the trigger and the pistol grip forward, which makes for a more compact overall length. If that's something you're looking for, then it's obviously a great feature. The trigger works on an articulated linkage through the body back to the main trigger housing, so you do save this sort of 5 or 6 inches of length. There is a downside that comes with that though, in terms of the open sights. So you've got a standard notch rear sight, much as you would have on an air rifle, and a bead full sight there. Because everything now is so much closer to your eye, I line up there like I'm going to shoot, my eye is, you know, what is that, 4 or 5 inches away from that sight notch, and you simply do not get a clear image on that rear sight with your eye that close to it. It's quite blurry. Purely for comparison purposes, if I take a conventional break barrel air rifle, which has really very similar sights but in a more conventional location, you'll see the difference in terms of the distance from your eye. It's my trusty old HW35. But you know, if I sight this rifle, much the same rear sight notch, but look at the distance from the rear sight notch to my eye. I mean, that is what, 16 inches or something. And as a result, the sights are lovely and clear, very precise, very accurate. Right. So I think the real point here is, whilst the semi-bullpup design definitely makes for a more compact rifle, beg your pardon, crossbow, but or rifle, it brings everything back. It also brings the sight back. So I would say you really need to plan to change that open rear sight out for another sighting system. And you've kind of got a few options here, right? It's fairly easy to remove. I actually replaced that screw with an Allen bolt earlier, but you know, the sight comes off very easily, right? I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Once you've taken that off, there's effectively a dovetail rail under there that you can use. A quick word on the dovetail rail, because it isn't quite standard. So I'm just going to get a pen and paper here. So the conventional dovetail rail kind of looks like that. So it tapers right up to the top, and obviously your mounts clamp. Your mounts kind of clamp in here like that, and then if they get, as long as they get a little bit of purchase around there, they'll be fine. The design of this, the profile of this is quite different. It's got the conventional dovetail profile, and then it's got a parallel sided bit at the top. The problem with that is you really need to make sure your mounts bite all the way down onto the dovetail, onto the tapered section. If they just clamp up here, they're obviously not going to hold on to it. I've got quite a large number of telescopic sight mounts spare, and probably only about half, maybe a third, actually had the right clearance there to get a good grip on the dovetail. So just be aware that you may need to buy some different mounts when you want to change the sights. So what I'll do now, I'll show you very quickly how to take this off. As I said, I had actually changed this screw for an Allen key. As they come out of the box, it's a regular Phillips screw. Take that off. Put this somewhere where I won't lose it. Wheel for the sight just comes off. Obviously that's the sight off. Obviously you can take the full sight off if you want to as well, just 2 screws each side. I'm going to leave it there for the moment because it doesn't really get in the way, but if you do find it gets in the way of loading the arrows, it's trivial to remove. To remove this stud here, you need to take the housing off. So there's just 3 Phillips screws to do that. This last one can be a little bit tough to remove, and it's threaded deep down in the action. So I'm just going to make sure I brace everything properly here because I don't want to chew the screw. Presumably because it's screwing into the polymer material, there's a lot of friction all the way, even when the screw is almost undone. So do be careful not to chew the heads. You can probably see the slight damage there where the head of the screw that I'd replaced actually kind of sheared off and disintegrated, which is why I replaced it. So this then comes free. You probably can't see it on the camera, but maybe you can see the profile I was talking about with the dovetail. And this screw, which is the reason we took this off, just unscrews from underneath. There, look. It's the stud for the rear sight elevation adjuster. I did try using them, but as I said, the notch was so close to your eye, the picture was so bad, it was really pointless. So budget to replace it more or less immediately if you want to actually hit anything. Right. And then we just assemble everything without that stud. just done those two up loosely, just so to make sure everything's lined up properly. And until I've done this one up tightly, I won't go back and fully tighten them. Do be very careful not to chew the head on this screw. As I said, there's quite a lot of torque, and being a self-tapper going into the polymer, it's an awkward screw to try and replace if you do damage it, I would suggest. So best avoid that in the first place. You don't need to go crazy tight, but obviously you do want it firm. Swap these down, same thing, firmly, but you don't need to wrench on it. It's not a car, you're not doing up a wheel nut. Right, there we go. And then you're free to mount an alternative rear sight on it. You've kind of got three choices with the proximity to your eye. One is an aperture sight, like a peep sight, just effectively a small hole. Would work fine. Personally, I prefer an optical sight. And once again, you've got to choose. You've got something like a red dot, and this is, I think this is a Hawk red dot I've got here, which I have tried on here. It works just fine. Obviously, it works with the very low eye relief, so you could bolt that on there, and that works just fine. But what I've chosen to put on here is this little compact scope. It's a 4x21. It's parallax adjustable. Parallax is right down to 5 yards, which is really why I chose it for this. And of course the fact that it's physically compact, which suits the crossbow itself. And it's got a nice short eye relief, which is key. Not all compact scopes have a particularly short eye relief. This one is both compact physically, so the eye piece can be quite far forwards, and it has a fairly short eye relief. So then we just bolt that on very quickly. Making sure, as I said, to get the clamps down in the tapered part of the dovetail. Make sure they don't inadvertently clamp on the parallel part of the profile, which will give you no strength, no rigidity, no purchase at all. And same thing when tightening these, right? I just tighten them with the small piece of the Allen key, the small leg, just to limit the torque, because it's really easy to strip the threads. They're fine threads in an alloy mount, so that'll do. And with the long leg, just the tiniest tweak just to feel the torque to make sure it's fine. There's no real movement, just making sure that it's consistently tight. I'm probably moving that not even a 1/16th of a turn, just a fraction. Yeah, that's fine. And what you've got there, if I mount this now, you can see, you know, you've still got a fairly short eye relief, but that is a perfectly clear picture. I can even move a tiny bit closer, it's still clear. Tiny bit further back, that's fine. And it is unusual to find telescopic sights like that, so if you do want a magnified sight as opposed to a red dot, which is normally not magnified, obviously, you may have to shop around to find something with a suitably short eye relief and a suitably compact length. There's probably not a great deal else worth talking about at this stage. What I'm going to do next is talk about the power and the accuracy. So I'm going to set up the chrono, I'm going to set up the target, and we'll do that in the next part of the video. Cheers. Okay, this is part 2 of my review of the Mancung 120-pound crossbow. As I mentioned in part 1, this is going to be around chrono testing, looking at the power of the thing and also the accuracy. Just before I do that, one thing I should have mentioned in the earlier video that I didn't, I'm going to cover now because it's quite important. So the prod obviously passes through the body of the bow. It's held in with an Allen headed bolt in the end that pushes down and stops it slocking around. that bolt was pressing directly into the fiberglass limb and started marking it. Not a great design. I've seen other bows that have steel or aluminium pieces for that bolt to press against, to guard against exactly that kind of damage. When you think about as well, right, you're basically risking damage to the centre of a limb that's under 120 pound pressure. It's obviously going to weaken it. So what I did, I'm not sure how well this will show up on the camera, but if you look up in there, you can see a shiny piece of metal. What it is, it's just basically a square of aluminium, about a 1/4 inch, no, a little bit less, maybe about 4 millimeters, 5 millimeters thick, that I've cut and inserted in there so that the bolt head in the end here that holds that prod in place pushes onto that aluminium, spreading the load across the whole prod, so it's not going to damage the prod. So for me, that's a bit of a, it's either a part was missing from my bow, and they're all supposed to have it because I have seen many that do, or it's a little bit of a design omission. Either way, it's fairly easy to fix. At a push, you could use like a 1p, probably even a 2p coin, just something in there to spread the load, so the head of that little bolt is not trying to burrow into the actual fiberglass limb and weakening it, which could potentially be quite dangerous. So, chronographing. So obviously, if we want to measure the power, two things we need: chronograph to measure the velocity, and we need to know the weight of the bolts that we're going to shoot. So, this down. So this comes with a couple of these 14-inch bolts. It only comes with 2, so obviously you're going to have to plan to buy more. It's enough to get you started, but no more. Quality isn't brilliant, but it's okay. You know, they'll do the job. I've got a number of other 14-inch bolts here, very similar design. I've also got some 16-inch bolts, which are easier to come by. And I've got 2 versions. These just have a heavier tip, so I'm going to weigh each type. We'll see if it makes any difference to the power. Right, so I've got some scales here to weigh the bolts. These actually weigh directly in grains, otherwise it's fairly easy to convert. So 14-inch bolts first. Let's start with the one came with. So that's 302 grains. Try some of these other Olmecs 14-inch. That's 300 grains. So try consistent, obviously. 310. So just over 300. So let's say the 14 inches are on average 305 grams. 16 inches. So do the light tipped versions first. That's 340. 340. That's quite consistent. 340 grain. A bit heavier, I mean that's more than 10% heavier. And the ones with the heavier tips, where I got these from, Ango Arms branded. It's 390. That's more than 10% heavier again. So it'll be interesting to see if that has an effect on our output. 70. Let's do one more. We've got 370 and 380. 385. So there you go. 385 average. Highs are 385. So that's my arrow weights. That's the scales done with. Now let's look at the feet per second through the chrono. Okay. You'll notice I've angled the chronograph, so I'm going to be shooting down. I want the chronograph beams to be perpendicular to the flight of the arrow into the centre of the target. Target I've got there, I've got basically two 2-inch thick, really very compacted straw targets with wooden boards behind. Behind that is a tree. I'm shooting at about 6 feet, so I'm not going to miss. It's pretty safe, and I know from experience that that really will stop anything before it even gets to the boards. The boards are there just in case something unexpected occurs. Cocking effort is firm. It's not trivial. It's not the heaviest crossbow. That's why I picked £120 because it isn't crazy heavy. But it's not trivial. You need to respect it. You need to use your legs. Don't put all the strain on your back, and just kind of be smooth and consistent. And when you're cocking it, there's a kind of a double click. The first click is the safety. The second is full engagement. Make sure you do get full engagement. There we go, 2 clicks. That's obviously cocked and ready. Safety automatically engages. Safety catch on this side here. Let's start with the lightest arrows first, 305 grains. The marked fletch goes into the groove in the barrel there, clips under there. Yep. So let's get the right angle. Looks good. Safety off. That's 227 feet per second. I'm going to shoot a couple of shots for each and just average them out, unless I get a significant variation, in which case I'll do a third. Just a note, the points on most of these are screw-in. These are coming slightly loose. Every now and again I'll just put a couple of little dabs of glue in there to stop them working loose. It doesn't need to be particularly strong glue because they're not under a lot of force. It's just to stop them rattling loose and causing you problems. So once again, keep the bow pointed safely down towards the ground when we're loading it. And at all times, just be very careful of where you're pointing it. I'm not going to take the safety off until I'm actually on target. So, pointing at target, just above the chrono. Make sure I don't shoot my same arrow. That's 224 feet per second. So just a couple of feet per second difference. So that's enough on that. It's 224, so we'll say 225, 226 average. So 225. So that's for the lightest 305 grain arrows. Let's see what effect the 340 grain arrows have, the 16-inch arrows. You expect obviously to lose some feet per second, but I don't know how much. Okay. Obviously I'm keeping my fingers away from the trigger as well. Whilst the safety's there, doesn't mean I'm going to rely on it. So it's 16-inch bolts, an extra 35 grains. You obviously expect to lose a little velocity, so let's see how much. Safety off. $217. So we didn't lose a huge amount, about 10 feet per second. Just making sure I've got the right arrow. $218, it's obviously very consistent there, so I'm not going to shoot anymore. 217, 218. All I'm going to do, the last couple of shots, I'm going to shoot the 16s with the much heavier points. See what kind of effect that has on velocity. And obviously in the final part of the video we'll be testing the accuracy. I've got no idea what to expect in terms of the heavier arrows, longer arrows versus the lighter, shorter ones. It'll be interesting to see if there's a correlation. So, safety off. Okay, there's quite a big velocity drop there, 207, so that's lost 20 feet per second. They are a lot heavier. It's 207 feet per second. Whilst I'm cocking this, it's probably worth mentioning that you can get a cocking rope for these. Hooks around the string, hooks around the back of the stock. In this case, I'll probably hook it through there, and it gives you about double the leverage. So it does make it easier to cock. It also makes it more consistent to cock by pulling the string back evenly both sides. And I'm going to invest in one myself. I haven't done so to date because the effort isn't too bad. It's firm, don't get me wrong, but it's not like it's going to kill me. But for consistency, for accuracy, I think it probably is worth the investment, so I will be getting one. Right, last one. So this is the heavier arrow. That one was 207. Safety not disengaged. 205, that's also very consistent. 207, 205, so we'll call that 206 feet per second. Right, I've done the calculations off camera to save boring you watching me key numbers into a calculator. I'm pretty surprised, to be honest. It's a fair way more powerful than I expected. So let's cut straight to it. So the 14-inch arrows, 305 grains, which we're doing 225 feet per second, just over 34 foot-pounds of energy. The 16 grains with the regular weight tips, which were a little heavier at 340 grain, doing 218 feet per second, were 35.5 foot-pounds, so just over a foot-pound more. And finally the 16-inch with the considerably heavier points, 385 grains overall, which were doing 206 feet per second, were a little higher again at 36.3 foot-pounds, which is a lot of energy, right? And I have to say, when I was pulling the arrows out of the target a moment ago, the actual effort of pulling those out of the straw, because it's quite a dense straw, compacted straw backstop, was really quite considerable. It was far more effort than actually cocking the crossbow, and it was most noticeable, unsurprisingly, on the slightly longer arrows that do have slightly more energy. So there you go. So we've got between 34 and 36 foot-pounds of energy from that 120-pound crossbow. The next thing I'm going to be testing is accuracy. So that's part 3. Right, folks, final part of this, I'm going to evaluate the accuracy. I'm shooting at about 18 yards, that's 16 meters. Fairly typical range, I guess, for a crossbow. We're going to try a few of the different types of bolts, see what kind of groupings we get. Right, so here's the first 5-shot group I've shot there with the lighter of the 16-inch bolts. Not bad at all, really. I mean, you've got 3 towards the bottom there virtually touching. What I did find, and I think what explains the slightly higher shots, is there's kind of a tendency with the fairly heavy trigger to pull and with it resting, it kind of tends to leap up a little bit. So I think with a bit of practice, a bit like shooting a spring-powered air gun, in terms of working out the right kind of hold on the fore end and squeezing that said fairly heavy, fairly long trigger, I think you could probably tighten it up to eliminate those higher shots. But yeah, not bad at all, really. That is, I mean, the bottom three are within 1.25 inches of each other, but obviously the vertical spread there, you're up to nearly, probably about 3.5 inches. So not too bad, but room for improvement. I'm going to try the lighter arrows, see if the higher velocity maybe reduces the sensitivity to the jumping or not. Right, now I'm going to shoot another 5-shot group with the shorter, lighter arrows, see if that has any useful effect on accuracy. So this is the 5-shot group using the 14-inch bolts. It's pretty shocking, really. I mean, you wouldn't even have thought it was done by the same crossbow or at the same range. We've gone from a kind of 2, 3, 4-inch group to, man, like a 14-inch group. I don't know what's going on there. I could, if it was just 1 or 2 off, I'd say okay, I'm sure that could be me. But there's no group of any description using these lighter arrows. So, not a result I expected, I'll be honest with you. I didn't think that'd be great deal of difference. So I'm now going to try the heaviest arrows, A, to see if I get back some accuracy, and B, to see if they may be even tighter again than the lighter 16-inch bolts. Let's see what happens. After that fairly disgraceful result with the shorter, lighter bolts, we're going to now try the heaviest ones. These were, I think, about 380 grains. You can see they've got heavier, larger points on them. We'll see if we get some accuracy back. Right, so here's the group with the heaviest 16-inch arrows. Now, it's not brilliant, it's certainly nothing like as good as the first group I shot with the lighter 16-inch, but, you know, compared with that appalling group I shot with the 14-inch bolts, it's okay. It's not great. It's about a 5.5-inch group, but it's so much better. So all I can really deduce at this stage is those 14-inch bolts, even though that's the length that actually comes included in the kit, really don't suit this, and you really should look at the 16-inch. So what I'm going to do now is the kind of obvious test, is go back to the slightly lighter, the mid-weight 16-inch bolts, and seeing if I can reproduce a group anything like the one I shot at the beginning, just to make sure it wasn't a fluke. Right then, folks, I'm just going to loop back to the same bolts I shot for that first group, which was pretty decent. And I'm really curious to know if that was a fluke, or if the selection of the bolts makes that much difference to the group size in this particular crossbow. Let's see. Wow, look at that, guys. I mean, there's not really much I can say. The difference the selection of the bolt makes to the group size is absolutely shocking. It's well-known concept in air rifles, even in 4-bore rifles. You know, you might go from, with an air rifle at 20 yards, you might go from a 2 or 3 inch group with a pellet that doesn't suit your rifle to you know, a 1/2 inch or even a 1/4 inch group with one that does. But if I hadn't have seen what we've just seen here with my own eyes, I would never have believed that simply selecting a different length bolt could have that dramatic effect on the accuracy. I mean, if you take that one slightly high right included in the group, we're on about 2.5 inches. If you take that one out, we're talking 1.25 inches for the other 4. You know, I'm not a perfect shot, and that's a pretty impressive group. Very similar, obviously slightly better than the first group I shot with those, but immeasurably better than the 14-inch bolts, and a fair bit better than the heavy 16-inch bolts. So I guess the conclusion here is, in exactly the same way that you do for air rifles and full-bore rifles, it really is trying different bolts, different lengths, different point weights to get the accuracy out of the bow. Well then, folks, a quick conclusion to wrap this one up. Don't use the 14-inch bolts that come with the crossbow. You're not going to get the best out of it in terms of accuracy. Do buy some regular weight 16-inch bolts. These are branded Anglo Arms. I've also seen them branded Armex. Do change the bolts, because it's very clear from this that you're not going to get the accuracy from the bolts that come with it. Just to sum up, overall, it's doing around 35 foot-pounds. That is a lot of energy. It kind of goes back to the point I made at the beginning, that this is really not a toy. You really need to take your backstop seriously. To recap, you absolutely need to plan to replace the open sights with either a red dot or some other form of optical sight, or possibly an aperture, although that's a bit of a niche. You do need to put some kind of protective metal spacer in there for the Allen bolt in the end that holds the prod in place to bear against, to save damaging the prod. But with those considerations, all in all, it can be a very accurate package for very little money. So if you are considering one, I certainly wouldn't rule it out.